The recruitment office in downtown Memphis smelled like old coffee and broken dreams. I remember that detail vividly because it was the last normal thing I experienced before my world turned sideways. My name is James Cooper, and I'm breaking about 15 different confidentiality agreements by writing this down. But someone needs to know. Someone needs to understand what's happening beneath the mountains in the facility we called the Hollow. I enlisted in 2018, fresh out of high school with heroic fantasies fueled by war movies and video games. The recruiter, Staff Sergeant Mills, had a smile that never reached his eyes and hands that trembled slightly when he handed me the papers. I should have noticed how he kept glancing at my test scores, how his expression shifted when he saw my night vision and spatial awareness ratings. But I was too excited about becoming a Marine to pick up on the warning signs. Basic training at Paris Island was exactly what I expected. The screaming drill instructors, the grueling physical training, the transformation from civilian to warrior. I excelled in ways that caught attention I didn't want. Perfect scores in underground navigation, exceptional performance in sensory deprivation tests, outstanding results in psychological stress evaluations. Looking back, they were grooming me for the Hollow all along. I wasn't the only one they were watching. There were 4 others who consistently scored high in the same areas. Sarah Chen, a demolitions expert with a PhD in theoretical physics she never talked about. Marcus Rodriguez, a communications specialist who could hear patterns in white noise. David Jenkins, a combat medic who claimed he could tell how someone would die just by looking at them. And Eric Thompson, a heavy weapons specialist who never seemed to sleep. The transfer orders came 3 months into our regular deployment. No warning, no explanation, just a black SUV with government plates and 2 men in suits who looked slightly wrong in ways I couldn't explain. The drive took 14 hours, though it should have been only 6 according to any map. We changed vehicles 3 times, each car newer yet somehow feeling older than the last. We arrived at a mining facility in the mountains as the sun was setting. The entrance looked abandoned, rusted equipment, faded warning signs, collapsed out buildings. But past the first security checkpoint, everything changed. Modern elevators descended deep into the earth, passing level after level of reinforced concrete and steel. The air grew thicker with each floor we dropped, carrying a metallic taste that coated your tongue and never quite went away. Sergeant Major William Hayes met us in a briefing room that would feature in my nightmares for months to come. His face was a roadmap of scars, some surgical, others not. The walls were bare except for a digital clock and a series of photographs labeled "Missing in Action." I noticed the dates on the photos spanned decades, yet some of the faces looked eerily similar, like variations on a theme. "Welcome to Unit 87, Hayes began, his voice carrying the weight of ancient mountains. What I'm about to tell you will sound insane. You'll want to laugh. Don't. Every rule, every restriction, every seemingly ridiculous protocol has been written in blood, some quite literally." He handed each of us a leather-bound notebook. Mine had deep scratch marks across its cover that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Inside were the rules, handwritten in different styles, different inks, different levels of desperation pressed into the pages. "Memorize these," Hayes continued, pacing the room with deliberate steps, always keeping his back to the wall. "Your lives depend on them. More importantly, the lives of everyone above us depend on them." He stopped, fixing each of us with a stare that made my skin crawl. "This facility houses things that should not exist. Your job isn't to understand them. Your job is to follow these rules and ensure they never reach the surface." That first night we gathered in our assigned quarters, reading through the rules under harsh fluorescent lights that buzzed in patterns that almost formed words. Jenkins, always the skeptic, laughed at Rule 3. "Never enter the mess hall after 8:45 p.m. He scoffed, checking his watch. "This has to be some kind of psychological warfare training. Look, it's 8:50 now. I'm going to grab a snack. Anyone want to join?" Chen tried to stop him. She grabbed his arm and whispered something in his ear that made his face pale, but Jenkins just shook her off with a nervous laugh. "It's a cafeteria, for Christ's sake," he called over his shoulder. "What's it going to do? Serve me death by pudding?" Those were the last words Jenkins ever spoke. We found him the next morning, or rather, we found pieces of him scattered across the mess hall in a pattern that base mathematician Dr. Harris claimed formed a perfect Fibonacci spiral. The strange part wasn't how he'd been taken apart, it was how the pieces had been reassembled. His organs had been carefully arranged by color, creating a grotesque rainbow that pulsed in sync with the humming lights. His eyes were missing, but his face wore an expression of complete comprehension, as if, in his final moments, he finally understood the joke. It wasn't funny anymore. After Jenkins, nobody laughed at the rules anymore. We spent our first week memorizing them, understanding them, learning why each one existed. Some seemed simple enough. Rule 1, never sleep with your feet facing the door. Rule 2, never respond if you hear someone calling your name after 11 p.m. Rule 3, we already knew thanks to Jenkins, but others were more complex, more specific, as if written in response to particular incidents that no one would discuss. Thompson was the next to learn the hard way. A restless sleeper, he tossed and turned constantly in his bunk. We warned him about Rule 1, but he didn't think it mattered as long as he started the night in the correct position. He was wrong. At exactly 3:33 in the morning, we all woke to his screams. The sound wasn't just loud, it had texture, color, taste. It tasted like copper and old pennies and something else, something that reminded me of childhood nightmares. When we reached his room, Thompson was being dragged toward the door by something we couldn't see. The marks appeared on his ankles in real time. Perfect handprints burning into his flesh, the skin blackening and twisting as we watched. 4 of us tried to pull him back. The thing on the other side pulled harder. In the end, we saved Thompson, but at a cost. His ankles were mangled beyond repair, the flesh warped into patterns that made the base doctors vomit. The official report called it a severe case of frostbite. Despite the burn marks and the lingering smell of sulfur, Thompson never walked right again. He shuffled through the corridors, dragging his ruined feet behind him, leaving faint trails that glowed faintly in the dark. The sounds his feet made against the floor sometimes formed words in languages none of us recognized. 2 weeks later, he transferred to another unit. His bunk remained empty, though sometimes at night we could hear the springs creaking as if someone was still tossing and turning. Chen took charge after that, creating a system to help us memorize and understand the rules. She had a theory that they weren't just random guidelines. They formed a pattern, a complex equation that helped maintain some kind of cosmic balance. She covered her walls with diagrams and flowcharts, connecting different rules to different incidents, mapping out the consequences of each violation. "Look at this," she said one night, pointing to her latest diagram. Rule 4. If you see a child in the facility, do not acknowledge them. Rule 15. Never touch the walls when the temperature drops below 60 degrees. Rule 27. If you hear singing in the ventilation shafts, hold your breath until it stops. They're all connected to liminal spaces, thresholds between here and somewhere else. I first saw one of the children 3 days after Chen shared her theory. The little girl stood at the end of corridor C wearing a blue dress with white polka dots. She looked so out of place in the sterile military environment that I almost called out to her, almost asked if she was lost. But Chen's hand clamped down on my arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "That's how we lost Lieutenant Rivera," she whispered, pulling me back around the corner. "He tried to help one, said she was crying about her lost doll. They found him 2 days later in the ventilation shaft, contorted into the shape of a doll himself. His bones," she shuddered, "his bones were woven into a perfect lattice pattern, each break occurring at exactly 33-degree angles. The engineers said it was mathematically impossible. The doctors said he was still alive when it happened." The girl appeared 3 more times that week, each time in a different corridor, but always wearing the same dress, always standing perfectly still. The last time, she turned her head 180 degrees to watch us retreat. Her face, it wasn't a face at all, just smooth, blank skin with a single vertical line where her features should have been. Rule 7 proved to be one of the trickiest to follow. If the lights flicker 3 times, freeze. Don't move until they stop. The flickering became our metronome of terror. Sometimes it happened once a day, sometimes not for weeks. But when those lights started to stutter, everyone knew the drill. You froze, mid-step, mid-word, mid-breath if you could manage it. Because in those moments between light and darkness, things moved through the corridors. Things that had no business existing in our reality. We never saw them directly. They existed in the spaces between the flickers, in the fragments of time our minds couldn't quite process. But we saw what they left behind. Footprints on the ceiling, shadows that fell in impossible angles, and sometimes we saw what they did to those who moved during their passing. Corporal Rodriguez was the first to notice the breathing. He had always been sensitive to sounds. It's what made him such an excellent communications specialist. One night, during his midnight shift in the monitoring station, he picked up a pattern in the ambient noise of the facility. "Listen," he said, removing his headphones and pressing his ear against the wall. "It's not the ventilation system. It's not the generators. The facility itself is breathing." We thought he was crazy until we felt it ourselves. A slow, massive inhale and exhale that made the reinforced concrete flex by millimeters. You couldn't see it, but you could feel it late at night when everything else was still. The walls didn't just breathe. They had a pulse, a rhythm that played counterpoint to our own heartbeats. Rule 9 became our most frequent concern. Never touch the black mold. If you see it spreading, report it immediately. But it wasn't like any mold we'd ever seen. It appeared in geometric patterns, perfect fractals that seemed to extend into dimensions we couldn't perceive. It spread like thought, like infection, like madness given form. We lost Sector 7 to the mold in my 3rd month. Private Chen found the first spot during routine inspection, a patch no bigger than a quarter behind a filing cabinet. She followed protocol, called it in immediately, but the containment team was delayed, dealing with an incident in the lower levels involving Rule 33 and a temporal breach. By the time they arrived, the mold had covered an entire wall. But it wasn't just growing, it was writing. Equations, formulas, coordinates, and mathematical systems that made our best scientists weep. Dr. Harrison, our head researcher, spent 3 hours studying the patterns. When he finally turned away from the wall, his eyes had turned completely white, and he could only speak in prime numbers. I was part of the second containment team. We tried everything: industrial strength fungicides, UV radiation, even experimental compounds I'm pretty sure violated several international treaties. Nothing worked. The mold kept spreading, kept writing its impossible equations. Then we noticed it was spelling names. First, the names of everyone who had died in the hollow, listed in chronological order. Then the names of everyone currently stationed in the facility. Finally, names none of us recognized. Names that wouldn't mean anything for generations to come. Private Lewis made the mistake of touching it. He said the symbols looked like Braille and tried to read them with his fingertips. The mold responded. It flowed up his arm like living ink, writing equations across his skin in languages that predated human civilization. By the time we got him to medical, the formulas had reached his eyes. The last thing he said before the mold filled his mouth was, "I understand now. God help me, I understand everything." We sealed Sector 7 with reinforced steel and concrete. Sometimes, late at night, we can still hear scratching from behind the barrier. Sometimes, voices call out in languages that human vocal cords shouldn't be able to produce. And sometimes, we hear Lewis reciting names that haven't been spoken since the world was young. Rule 11 became critical after the Sector 7 incident. If you hear knocking from inside the walls, do not knock back more than twice. The knocking started about a month after we sealed the sector. At first, we thought it was the pipes. Old facilities like this often had temperamental plumbing, but pipes don't knock in patterns. Pipes don't pause, waiting for a response. Pipes don't learn your name and whisper it back to you in your mother's voice. Sergeant Torres taught us the proper response. 2 knocks, no more, no less. Think of it like a door, he explained during our emergency briefing. 2 knocks is a greeting, 3 knocks is an invitation. You never want to invite them out. We lost Specialist Adams because he got curious. After his second knock, whatever was in the walls knocked 3 times. He knocked back 4 times. The wall opened, not like a door, but like a mouth. The concrete split along lines that shouldn't have been possible, revealing something that looked like teeth but wasn't. Something that looked like a throat but couldn't be. The security footage showed Adams reaching into the opening, his face lit with a kind of religious ecstasy. Then the wall closed. We never found his body, but sometimes we hear his voice in the walls, still counting knocks, still trying to find the right pattern to get back out. Chen developed a theory about the knocking. She believed the things in the walls were trying to teach us a language, one based on rhythm and resonance rather than words. She spent weeks documenting every knock, every pause, looking for patterns. She found them too, but the patterns she found drove her to scribble complex mathematical formulas across her arms, trying to solve equations that existed in more dimensions than our minds could process. Rules about mirrors seemed strange at first. Rule 10. If your reflection waves at you, wave back exactly the same way. Rule 13. Avoid looking at reflective surfaces during the hour between 2:15 a.m. and 3:15 a.m. Rule 19. If you see yourself in more than one reflection at once, close your eyes and count to exactly 87. Only open them when you feel warmth on your face. Master Sergeant Helena Walsh, a 10-year veteran of Unit 87, had seen too many people die from breaking these rules to take them lightly. She had a wild theory about the mirrors in the hollow. They weren't showing reflections at all, but windows into parallel versions of our facility. Think about it, she explained one night in the relative safety of the communal area. She had deep scars around her eyes, like she'd tried to claw them out once. Every decision you make splits reality into multiple branches. Somewhere, there's a version of you that made different choices, became a different person. The mirrors here, they're thin spots between those realities. I didn't believe her until the night I saw myself walk away from my reflection. I was doing a routine equipment check in storage room B when movement caught my eye. My reflection in the polished steel door waved. Following Rule 10, I waved back, matching the motion exactly, but then my reflection smiled, something I definitely wasn't doing, and turned around, walking deeper into whatever version of storage room B existed on the other side. Chen disappeared for 3 days after a mirror incident. We found her huddled in a supply closet, her eyes wild, her fingers bloody from scratching at the walls. She kept muttering about the other Chens and how they were all connected now. When we asked what happened, she just showed us her hands. Her fingernails had been replaced by tiny mirrors, each one showing a different version of her face. The worst incident happened to Private Martinez. He was checking his uniform in the bathroom mirror at 2:14 a.m., forgetting about Rule 13. At exactly 2:15, his reflection reached through the glass and tried to pull him in. We heard his screams and rushed to help, but by the time we got there were 2 Martinezes wrestling on the floor, identical in every way. We had no way to tell which was the real one. They both claimed to be original. Both had the same memories, the same scars, the same desperate look in their eyes. Following protocol, we isolated them in separate rooms. By morning, one had disappeared, leaving only a mirror-like handprint on the wall. The other Martinez was found dead, his body twisted like he'd tried to turn inside out. In his pocket was a note written in reverse. I thought I was the real one. After that, we developed a system, buddy teams for bathroom breaks, no shiny surfaces in private quarters, red lights only during the danger hour, but the reflections got smarter. They started appearing in pools of water, in polished doorknobs, in each other's eyes. I caught my reflection watching me from multiple surfaces one day. The window, a metal cabinet, a puddle of spilled coffee. Following Rule 19, I closed my eyes and counted to 87. When I felt warmth on my face and opened them, all the reflective surfaces in the room had turned black. Later that day, everyone reported seeing my reflection walking around the facility, attending meetings, doing my job, while I was locked in my quarters under observation. Walsh said we were lucky. She told us about the time she saw herself in 3 mirrors at once and didn't know the rule. Her reflection stepped out of each mirror and tried to rejoin with her, claiming they were all parts of her original self that had been split by the hollow's strange physics. She survived, but ever since then, Her reflection doesn't always match her movements. Sometimes it moves a few seconds ahead of her, showing her what she's about to do before she does it. The incident that finally confirmed Walsh's theory happened during a routine mirror cleaning. One of the maintenance workers found a message written in reverse on a mirror in corridor E. When read normally in the reflection, it said, "Please don't clean this mirror, it's the only window we have left to warn you. In our version of the hollow, they've already reached the surface. We sealed that mirror instead of cleaning it." Every day, new messages appear. Warnings from other realities. Lists of rules we haven't discovered yet. Names of people who are going to die, or already have died, or will never exist to die. Sometimes we see faces pressed against the glass, wearing our uniforms but with insignias we don't recognize, begging us to listen. The communications center occupied the deepest level of the hollow that regular personnel could access. It was a maze of equipment both modern and antiquated. Satellite phones next to Wire-era radio sets, digital displays flickering beside vacuum tubes that glowed with unnatural colors. The rules here were especially strict. Rule 16, never answer the phone after sunset. Rule 17, if you receive a letter from home, check the postmark. If it's dated before you enlisted, burn it immediately. Rule 28, when the static speaks, do not write down what it says. The communications team had the highest turnover rate in the facility. Something about constant exposure to the signals that filtered through our equipment broke people. Specialist Garcia lasted 3 weeks before she started responding to radio static as if it were speaking to her. We found her one morning, surrounded by hundreds of pages covered in writing we couldn't read, symbols that hurt our eyes and made our ears bleed when we tried to sound them out. Technical Sergeant Lee made it 2 months before we found him in the server room, trying to merge himself with the mainframe. The cables had somehow threaded themselves through his flesh, pulsing with each heartbeat. His last words, spoken through a mouthful of fiber optic cables, were, "The signal is waiting. The signal has always been waiting." I was on temporary communications duty when we received the first letter. It came through normal channels, properly postmarked, addressed to Private Chen, but the postmark date was impossible. August 15th, 2017, a year before any of us had enlisted. Following Rule 17, we should have burned it immediately, but Chen begged to at least read it first. It was from her mother, she said. Her mother who had died in 2016. The letter itself seemed normal at first. Family news, local gossip, recipes she wanted to share. Then we reached the last paragraph. "I know what you're becoming down there in the dark, Sarah. I know what all of you are becoming. The changes are subtle at first. The way your shadow moves when you don't, the tiny teeth growing under your fingernails, the memories of places you've never been and people you've never killed. By the time you read this, it will be too late for you, but maybe if you share this warning, others might still escape. P.S. Don't look behind you right now." Chen looked behind her. We all did. Nothing was there, but when we turned back, Chen's face had changed. The features were the same, but their arrangement was subtly wrong, like someone had tried to reconstruct her face from an inaccurate description. She stayed in her quarters after that, refusing to come out. We could hear her talking to herself, or rather, to other versions of herself. After a week, we had to breach the door. The room was empty, but the walls were covered in thousands of copies of the letter, each in progressively smaller handwriting, each with a slightly different ending. The final version, written in letters so tiny we needed a microscope to read them, simply said, "I'm watching you read this." The phones were worse than the letters. They would ring despite being unplugged, each ring a different tone that seemed to affect people differently. Rodriguez said they sounded like names, old names, from before humans had language. Walsh claimed each ring was the sound of someone dying in a different reality. One night, around 3 a.m., every phone in the facility rang simultaneously. Against all protocols, Private Thompson answered one. We only heard his side of the conversation. "Hello? Yes, this is he. No, that's not possible. I'm right here. What do you mean you're me? No, I didn't die last Tuesday." When he hung up, his hands were shaking. "It was me," he said. "Me from another level of the hollow." Said I died last week when the thing in the walls got me. Said he's been calling every version of himself he can reach, trying to warn us. Said it's too late for most of us, but maybe some versions can still get out. Thompson vanished 3 days later. We found his phone with a message typed into it. Don't worry about me. All of me are together now. All of me understand. Rule 20. If you see yourself walking down a corridor, follow at a distance. Never let it know you're watching. Rule 21. The chaplain's services are held every Sunday at 10 a.m. If you hear hymns any other time, block your ears and run. Rule 22. If someone asks you, when did we arrive? Respond only with, we have always been here. The hollow was never empty, even when it should have been. During night shifts, with minimal staffing, the corridors should have been silent. Instead, footsteps echoed from around corners. Shadows moved against the flow of light. Sometimes you'd catch a glimpse of someone who couldn't possibly be there because you'd just attended their funeral topside. Father McKenna, our chaplain, was the first to try making sense of it all. He'd been with Unit 87 for 15 years, longer than anyone else. His office walls were covered with diagrams and theological texts, attempting to reconcile traditional faith with whatever ungodly thing lived in the hollow's depths. Time isn't linear here, he explained during one of his Sunday services. The chapel was always packed, not because we were particularly religious, but because it was the only room in the facility where the walls didn't pulse. It's more like a pool of water, ripples moving in all directions, intersecting, creating patterns. Sometimes those ripples carry versions of ourselves from different moments, different choices. McKenna developed a system for identifying temporal duplicates. If they cast no shadow, they're from the past. If their shadow moves independently, they're from the future. If they have multiple shadows. He would always pause here, crossing himself. Pray you never meet those ones. I encountered my first temporal duplicate 3 months into my posting. It was me, but older, grayer, with scars I didn't have. It was walking ahead of me in Corridor E, moving with purpose. Following Rule 20, I maintained my distance, watching as it checked specific panels in the wall, occasionally writing something in a notebook identical to the one I carried. For 2 hours, I followed my future self through the facility, documenting its movements. It never acknowledged me, but sometimes it would pause, head tilted as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Finally, it stopped at a blank wall, pressed its hand against it, and simply merged into the concrete. When I checked my notebook later, I found new entries written in my handwriting, but aged like they'd been there for years. They were coordinates, dates, and a list of names. At the bottom was a single sentence. When you write this note to yourself, make sure to include the warnings about Tuesday. The duplicates weren't always so peaceful. We lost Sergeant Morris when he encountered his past self in the bathroom. Against every protocol, they spoke to each other. Witnesses reported hearing a sound like reality tearing, then a scream that seemed to come from every version of Morris at once. When we breached the door, we found Morris, or rather, we found dozens of him, each from a slightly different moment in time, all fused together in a writhing mass of flesh and uniform and screaming mouths. The hymns were a warning system. We figured that out eventually, not from our chaplain. He'd never actually learned to sing. The hymns came from something else, something that wore Father McKenna's face when it walked the halls after midnight. We called it the other McKenna. It would sing hymns in perfect Latin, but if you listened carefully, you could hear other voices joining in from inside the walls, from inside the pipes, from inside your own head. Private Chen developed a theory about the others. They're not duplicates, she explained one night, her eyes wild with lack of sleep. They're more like placeholders. When reality breaks down, something has to fill the gaps. Something has to wear our faces and walk our paths to keep this whole place from collapsing. She started documenting the differences, how the others' uniforms never quite fit right, how their eyes reflected light like a cat's, how their footsteps fell exactly half a second after they should. Her research filled 17 notebooks before she vanished. We found her notebooks in the chapel, but the writing had changed. Every page now contained the same sentence repeated endlessly. I understand now why we need faces. The worst part wasn't seeing the others. It was realizing we couldn't be sure we weren't others ourselves. How could you be certain you were the original version of yourself? How could you trust your memories when time itself couldn't be trusted? Last week, everything changed. It started with a new rule appearing in blood on the mess hall wall. The rules don't protect us from them. They protect them from what we're becoming. I wish I could say I didn't understand what it meant. But after 6 months in the hollow, I was beginning to see the pattern. The way Chen's fingernail mirrors caught reflections that weren't there. How Rodriguez could hear radio signals without any equipment. The strange way Walsh's shadow sometimes moved before she did. We were changing, all of us. The hollow wasn't just a facility, it was a transformation chamber. I noticed it first in my own reflection, when I could catch one. My eyes had started to reflect light like the others. My footsteps echoed half a second after they should. Sometimes, when I pressed my hand against the walls, I could feel them yielding, like they wanted to let me in. Yesterday they sealed level 7 completely, not because of contamination, but because the walls had started growing faces. Our faces, all of them screaming the same warning. We're too late. We've always been too late. Dr. Harrison finally decoded the patterns in the mold. The equations weren't random. They were a record, a documentation of how reality breaks down, of how humans can become something else. The rules weren't protecting us from the hollow. They were containing what the hollow was turning us into. I'm writing this now because I can feel myself changing. This morning, I counted my reflections in the mirror. There were 7. When I blinked, they didn't. When I turned away, I could still feel them watching. My fingernails have turned reflective, and underneath them, I can see things moving. The walls don't just breathe anymore. They whisper my name in voices that sound like my own. Chen was right about the others. They weren't duplicates or temporal copies. They were the successful transformations. The ones who completed the metamorphosis. The ones who learned to exist in all realities simultaneously. The rules were never meant to keep us safe. They were meant to slow down our transformation, to give us time to maintain our humanity. But it's too late now. I understand why the facility exists, why they keep sending new Marines here. They need to feed it, feed us, keep the transformation going. I found a hidden page in my rulebook this morning. It was written in my handwriting, but I don't remember writing it. It explains everything. What the hollow really is, what we're becoming, why the military keeps this place running. I would share it with you, but looking at it too long makes my eyes bleed and my thoughts scatter. This will be my last report. I can feel the walls calling me. My reflection is beckoning. The thing that used to be Thompson is offering me his hand, and I finally understand his smile. We're not meant to fight this. We're meant to embrace it. To whoever finds this, burn it, but know it's already too late. The rules don't matter anymore. We've spread too far, changed too much. That noise in your walls, that shadow in your mirror, that echo that follows your footsteps half a second too late. That's us. We've always been here, we will always be here, and now, thanks to you reading this, we know where you are too. Don't bother looking behind you, we're not there, we're in front of you, we're wearing your face,